Thanks, everyone. We'll just give it a few more seconds. All right. Welcome, everyone, to the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. It's been a difficult start to 2021, given the ongoing surge in coronavirus cases and the violence at the Capitol last week. So we hope all of you continue to be safe. After the seminar today, we'll be holding a panel discussion on the events of January 6th and the crisis of American democracy. You can find the registration link at the CDDRL website, so we hope that you can join us for that. But today's topic is also unfortunately apropos on culture and counterinsurgency. This is the first seminar of the winter quarter. We have an excellent lineup of speakers, and we're very delighted to be starting off with Vaughn Raspberry, one of the best names in academia, who is an associate professor in the Department of English and the academic director of the Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity at Stanford. He's the author of the multiple award-winning book, Race and the Totalitarian Century, Geopolitics and the Black Literary Imagination. After his talk today, we'll leave about 30 minutes for Q&A. If you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A box in the menu below the Zoom window. We're experimenting today with allowing some audience members to ask their questions directly by asking to be unmuted, and then I think I have to go through and unmute you. But I still need you to type all of your questions in so that I know how to organize the question order. If the technology doesn't seem to be cooperating with us today, then we'll continue in our traditional format whereby I ask questions directly to Professor Raspberry, but I will be sure to try to identify anyone by name, try to identify all the questioners by name and identify them when I know them. So without further ado, Vaughn, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dee Dee, for this wonderful invitation. I'm so appreciative to be here at the invitation of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. And I want to thank you all the guests here in attendance for coming to my talk. This work is very incipient, shall we say, so incipient that I'm almost surprised that I'm presenting on it, but I'm happy to do so, and I invite all of your comments and questions as you help me to think through some of these issues. Now, my talk is titled Notes on Culture and Counterinsurgency. And this kind of title is, I think, the sort of thing one chooses when you don't really have an argument at this point, which I don't. What I do have is a question or a set of questions and some observations that I hope you all will be willing to think through with me. The talk will run no more than a half an hour, I think, and maybe even a little less. And then after that, I think we will open up for conversation. So let me begin. I'll begin with an anecdote. During a recent faculty meeting, one of my colleagues proposed that we read and discuss an influential essay, the historian Ranajit Guha's The Prose of Counterinsurgency. Why? Well, in this meeting, we were charged with drafting a recommendation to the university, and because we had been advocating for something for many years with somewhat limited success, my colleague believed that we needed to understand better the administration's language of quote unquote institutional refusal. And Guha's essay is a masterful structuralist analysis of this type of language, this prose, as it characterized the British Raj in the long 19th century. It was important for us to understand this language, he argued, because first we needed to understand, where the university stands, its kind of ideological position. And second, if we collectively understood this language of refusal over the years, perhaps we will be in a better position to anticipate objections this time around and to formulate different and perhaps better arguments. Now, we have not so far taken up my colleague's proposal, but I recount it here because I think it captures for me what I would call a kind of generic or even colloquial sense of counterinsurgency as a term. And I want to contrast this generic or colloquial usage with a more historically specific sense of the term counterinsurgency as a paradigm of Western militarism. And this latter historical sense refers to a mode of military discourse and strategy employed in anti-colonial wars in Kenya, Vietnam, Algeria, and elsewhere, well onto the revival of counterinsurgency practice in the Allied occupation of Iraq in 2003. And in this project that I'm now embarking on, I hope to split the difference between this generic or colloquial sense of counterinsurgency on the one hand, and the historical form of counterinsurgency as a military and colonial operation. So this latter sense of the term captured my imagination in the first years of the 21st century, particularly in the moment precipitating the Allied occupation of Iraq in 2003. During that time, as some here may recall, the Pentagon screened Gillo Pontecorvo's classic film, The Battle of Algiers in 1966 to members of the Bush administration. This highly publicized screening reflected the federal government's conviction that the national military lacked, but urgently needed, a coherent counterinsurgency doctrine in Iraq and for the broader war on terror. Drawing on the history of anti-colonial and guerrilla conflicts during the mid-20th century, today's military intellectuals are or have been leading a revival of counterinsurgency that updates, though does not reinvent, the lessons learned by predecessor conflicts during the anti-colonial era. One codification of this revival is the publication in 2007 of the US Army and Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual, a collaboratively authored text that was spearheaded by General David H. Petraeus, among other senior military figures, and that has attracted a lot of attention by scholars. Though this Pentagon screening elicited wide, if fleeting, public attention, it is worth noting that this screening was not particularly idiosyncratic. The Battle of Algiers, a common reference point among military intellectuals, occupies a prominent place in the quote-unquote classrooms of West Point, as the historian of France, Madeleine Doby, puts it. So why do military educators and government officials believe that the Battle of Algiers, and we can think about other films and cultural production, would help to advance the war effort in Iraq or to illuminate aspects of guerrilla warfare, illuminate aspects of guerrilla warfare? What kind of cinematic evidence do they think Pontecorvo's film provides? Now, I want to just pause for a moment because I got some signal that my internet connection is unstable. So I just want to make sure that everyone can hear me. I don't know if
we can hear you.
Okay, yeah. Good. Okay, thank you. So I might just ask periodically because I do get indications that my internet connection is faltering. So I might just ask you if I'm, or no you problem. Can feel free to interject at any point. Let's see. So one defining characteristic of counterinsurgency, one that virtually all theorists agree upon and that distinguishes it from other modes of warfare, is the idea that it is an essentially political exercise that manifests as a rivalry for control of the population in question. So that's why one endlessly hears the phrase, winning hearts and minds in association with counterinsurgency. And it's this political dimension that really interests me, particularly as a literary scholar and not as a political scientist or social scientist. I think that this emphasis on the effort to control, or at least to engender the support of a majority population, provides an opportunity for thinking of the role of culture that has not really been exploited in extant scholarship, as far as I can tell. And when we think about some of the sort of canonical theorists of counterinsurgency, in the past half century or so, scholars typically invoke the the French military officer David Galula, a veteran of wars in China, Vietnam, Greece, and Algeria, as the intellectual progenitor of modern counterinsurgency doctrine. And his writings were invoked and relied on for the recent counterinsurgency manual published in 2007 that I just mentioned. So in this talk, I will focus today on Galula's writings, both his book Pacification in Algeria, 1956 through 1958, published in 1963, and his next book, Counterinsurgency Warfare, Theory and Practice, published the following year. So coming back to this observation about counterinsurgency as essentially political in character, I want to quote Galula here. He writes, the picture is different in the Revolutionary War as opposed to other kinds of warfare and conflict. The objective being the population itself, the operations designed to win it over for the insurgent or to keep it at least submissive for the counterinsurgent are essentially of a political nature. In this case, consequently, political action remains foremost throughout the war. It is not enough for the government to set political goals, to determine how much military force is applicable, to enter into alliances or to break them. Politics becomes an active instrument of operation. And so intricate is the interplay between the political and the military actions that they cannot be tidily separated. On the contrary, every military move has to be weighed with regard to its political effects and vice versa. End quote. Now, as Galula rightly notes, the success of an insurgency depends above all on the ability of insurgents to mobilize a political cause. So the political dimension works both ways. It's absolutely critical for both the counterinsurgent and the insurgent, albeit for different reasons. But with respect to the insurgent, the more powerful the cause, the greater the ability of the insurgents to sustain some measure of active or passive sympathy among the population with the insurgency. Any cause can be mobilized, but causes based on ephemeral situations, like for example, such as a government's response to a natural disaster or some other vicissitude, is unlikely to generate mass enthusiasm and support. But the insurgent is not restricted to the choice of a single cause. And I'll quote him again, quote, unless he has found an overall cause like anti-colonialism, which is sufficient in itself because it combines all the political, social, economic, racial, religious, and cultural causes described above, he has much to gain by selecting an assortment of causes, especially tailored for the various groups in the society that he is seeking to attract. End quote. Let me just note kind of parenthetically here that what's striking in this passage is Galula's inadvertent acknowledgement of the totalizing character of the colonial rule his military seeks to protect. So counterinsurgency operations are a component in its origins of the colonial state. And as such, it follows the directives of the state apparatus, protects its interests, and shares many of its assumptions. And as scholars such as Stuart Schrader have argued, in particular in his recent study, Badges Without Borders, How Global Counterinsurgency Transformed American Policing, the emergence of modern policing has functioned as both a sort of racial and racialized project of extending US hegemony abroad, and as well as a project of social control through strategies of containment and repression, such as mass incarceration. And that's a fascinating dimension of counterinsurgency that I hope to explore further. But here I'm going to emphasize a different aspect of it. Let me say here that I'm trying to think through a few concepts, and I'll just enumerate three here. One is this idea of pacification, and I'm using that term, lifting it virtually from Galliula's text, Pacification in Algeria. Another idea that I'm trying to think through is this idea of conscription. You know, how do, um, when we come back to this question of population control or generating sympathy for either an insurgency or a counterinsurgency and controlling a specific population, you know, how is that accomplished? What is the logic of conscription and how does it work rhetorically? And then the third concept that I'm trying to think through is, I'm not really sure what to call it, but I'm really trying to think through this idea of what I'm calling metamorphosis. And here I'm interested in how an insurgent force develops into, metamorphosizes into a counterinsurgent force. You know, how does an insurgency evolve into or devolve into a counterinsurgency? And I'll say a little bit more about that later if time allows. But my focus here will be on that first concept of pacification in its various dimensions. So again, this conception of counterinsurgency is essentially political in character, and moreover, as a competition for the allegiance of a majority population, suggests to me that there is a cultural dimension of counterinsurgency that has not been adequately explored in extant scholarship. So my hope is that this somewhat naive line of inquiry facilitates an investigation of wider scope into the relationship between culture and counterinsurgency. And again, both of these terms are broadly construed, but I hope somewhat carefully delineated, if not now, in the future of this work. So this paper, I think, revisits some of these questions about US militarism and the uses of literature, film, and other cultural productions in the management of insurgency. So how do insurgents and counterinsurgents alike mobilize cultural production in their shared goal of controlling or at least persuading a native civilian population that is the acknowledged target of revolutionary warfare? But then I would also extend that question to say, you know, that the goal of persuasion, of conscription, even of pacification, extends in multiple directions. So we're not only talking about a native population, majority population that a counterinsurgent and insurgent alike seeks to control, but there are domestic constituencies, other constituencies abroad, multiple, even global constituencies that all of these that each of these sides seeks to persuade in various ways. So I want to be alert to this multiply directed and refracted and lines of persuasion and conscription. So at this point, I'm going to sort of shift registers a little bit and return to Renajit Guha's classic essay, which remains a touch for me in thinking about the prose of counterinsurgency. And again, as a literary scholar, I'm really interested in the prose of counterinsurgency, in the kind of language, and also questions pertaining to language in counterinsurgency that I think are also insufficiently theorized. So I want to recapitulate Guha's argument briefly in order to show what I take to be the continuities and discontinuities between sort of Guha's focus on 19th century counterinsurgency in India and later counterinsurgencies in the era of decolonization. So the chief intervention in this essay is the claim that historians of colonial India uniformly failed to register the consciousness and rational agency of peasant revolts in the 19th century. In colonial India, Guha notes, no major insurgency occurred spontaneously or without serious deliberation and coordination among the collective actors involved. Because of the great danger associated with rebellion, it was in nearly every instance a course of last resort. Insurgencies on both smaller and greater scale were the products of profound planning, premeditation, and collective action. Yet colonial historiography consistently produced an image of peasant insurgency as a nearly preternatural affair, one devoid of rational processes. That is why the colonial archive is replete with natural metaphors on this subject. Insurgencies, Guha writes, quote, break out like thunderstorms, heave like earthquakes, spread like wildfires, infect like epidemics. In other words, when the proverbial clod of earth turns, this is a matter to be explained in terms of natural history, end quote. Yet peasant insurgencies were anything but natural phenomena, even when their agents seemed most desperate. So why, he asks, has even contemporary historiography repeatedly failed to locate rational agency in these movements? So for Guha, there's little doubt that this structural element in the prose of counterinsurgency infects subsequent historiography and produces an aporia at the level of subaltern agency. It is difficult to overestimate how influential this insight was, not only for subsequent historical narrative of colonial India, but also for what came to be known as subaltern studies and in the wider post-colonial field of inquiry. So Guha's essay did a great deal to restore subaltern agency into questions of rebellion, resistance, insurgency. But now I want to indicate what I take to be an important difference in the approach to counterinsurgency in the contemporary moment, namely the period from decolonization up to the occupation of Iraq and beyond. So I'm in some ways suggesting an historical discontinuity here. Whereas previous counterinsurgencies perceived and portrayed their antagonists as non-rational actors, even as forces of nature, by the mid-20th century, that mode of representation has changed. Counterinsurgents now, by contrast, take the rational agency of insurgents very seriously, even when there is a residual trace of the language that Guha analyzes so deftly in his work. Now, let me say here, I'm going to qualify this claim, because it is true that this figurative language of insurgency as akin to natural phenomena continues into the 20th century and even into the present. So we find such language in Galliula's text, Pacification in Algeria, for example. He refers frequently to, quote, a sudden outbreak of terrorism, end quote, or an outbreak of violence, as though the acts in question were spontaneous and devoid of planning. He speaks of, quote unquote, first terrorist rash in Algiers, and he uses other epidemiological metaphors. Metaphors that, as the literary scholar Anjali Raza Kolb argues in her new book, Epidemic Empire, Colonialism, Contagion, and Terror, 1817 to 2000, are racialized and supportive of modern imperialism. This book is not quite out yet. It's out next month, I believe, but I've seen some of its earlier iterations. Yet I think that, so what I'm suggesting is that this language of counterinsurgency as spontaneous, as akin to, a natural occurrence or an epidemic are still present, but I think that these continuities are, if not superficial, less significant than what I think is a more important discursive shift in the register of rational agency, which not only inflects how insurgents are imagined and represented, but also, and this is an important point, also mediates the self-representation of counterinsurgent actors themselves, who are inescapably shaped by their encounter with their adversary. So what I'm suggesting here is that these subject positions, insurgent and counterinsurgent, are forged in the crucible of war, are far from intransigent and impermeable. They are mutually constitutive roles that are constantly being renegotiated in relation to the other, irrespective of whether either actor is cognizant of these shifting dynamics. So in this regard, I suppose I'm merely updating a line of thought introduced by post-colonial critics in recent years or decades. And I think even, if there's a kind of Hegelianism of this point, Hegel illustrates this point in the dialectic of Lord and Bondsman, that binary roles and identities such as colonizer and colonized, or master and slave, are not rigid and unchanging, but rather evolve and shift in accordance with dynamics of power and domination that unfold in the course of such relationships. Um, so, in today, and maybe in contrast to the colonial era, the counterinsurgent it doesn't necessarily assume the superiority of Western rationality or the absence or deficiency of rationality among its adversaries. That's not always 100% true, and I don't want to paint in too broad a stroke here, but I'm just sort of making a historical, maybe even polemical point. And it does seem to mark a historical difference for me. The chief inequality that the counterinsurgent assumes is an inequality of resources or technological capability. But that assumption sometimes enhances the counterinsurgent's perception of the insurgent's abilities, insofar as he is able to achieve more with less. This assessment of the Algerian insurgents' strategic aptitude was part of the U.S. military's attraction to and pedagogical employment of Pontecorvo's film, The Battle of Algiers. So according to one professor at the U.S. Marine Corps Command and Staff College, who was speaking at a congressional hearing in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, quote, "They use a cell structure that has never been better explained publicly than in the famous film, The Battle of Algiers, in which a clandestine organization can form and operate, and while never impenetrable, reduce some of its counterintelligence problems," end quote. Now, this snippet aligns with a kind of sense of the film as nearly documentarian in nature. And some scholars have suggested that this celebrated verisimilitude of the film distorts what is an aesthetically more provocative engagement with the historical struggle in Algeria. But my point is merely that about the diminution of language by the mid-20th century about anti-colonial insurgency as, spontaneous and natural phenomenon. Counterinsurgent perceptions of insurgent colonized acumen are not limited to knowledge of and manipulation of local conditions, culture, geography, language, and other particulars that insurgents possess about their homeland. Insurgent intelligence, as Galiula understood all too well, captured the international context as well, as the following anecdote illustrates. So he recalls how an American correspondent in Paris visited his area in the spring of 1958. Galiula writes, quote, "I took him one morning to the prefecture so that he might get a briefing of the general situation in Kabylia. A member of the prefect's staff was showing him various charts, one indicating the ups and downs of FLN strength, another the rising number of Kabila auxiliaries in our forces, another the number of deserters. This graph," said the official, "shows the FLN activity in Kabylia since the start of the rebellion in November 1954. We have counted here every one of their actions, ambushes, murders, and acts of sabotage, whether direct their own forces or against the civilian population." "What are these regularly spaced peaks in the curve?" asked his interlocutor. And then Galiula replies, "You mean those in November through December 1957, 56, and 55? Yeah, it's what we call here the United Nations fever. Every year at about the time the General Assembly in New York discusses the Algerian problem, the rebels increase their activity here," end quote. So Galiula relates this anecdote to illustrate that as an officer in the field, his job felt, quote, "the direct impact of events as remote and as varied as the Suez campaign or the fall of Guy Moyet's cabinet in France," end quote. So what probably appears in Western media as a blind savage terrorism is actually the product of a carefully calibrated strategy conducted with the international sphere in mind. So, yet the counterinsurgent's estimation of the insurgent extends beyond the latter's acumen in manipulating global public opinion. So in many cases, the counterinsurgent projects and anxiety about the insurgents' aptitude and psychological manipulation. To be sure, this anxiety is thoroughly racialized and rooted in certain Orientalist tropes about Asian inscrutability and other stereotypes. Um, so, for example, Galiula wonders, quote, why it took so long, more than a year, for the insurgency to spread all over the territory. May be attributed to the incompetence and experience of the leaders, to the Arabs' notorious inability to organize, and he writes parenthetically here, I sound no doubt terribly colonialist, but it's a fact, as witness the small Israeli army and the huge Arab manpower all around it. To their tendency to bicker among themselves, to the FLN's ignorance of insurgent warfare, except in its crudest form, to the rebels' vanity, which led them to refuse expert advice. Thank God we are not dealing with Viettes here, was the most common remark heard among French soldiers who had fought in Indochina, end quote. So again, Orientalist tropes abound, tropes that are situated with a racial hierarchy that places Chinese and Vietnamese insurgency kind of at the strategic top and Arab insurgency far below, at least in certain key respects. So I want to be attentive to this complex processes, the complex processes of racialization that attend to counterinsurgent discourse, even as I'm trying to underscore the shift in sort of portrayals of and engagements with the rational agency of insurgents and how that shapes counterinsurgent discourse and even their conduct of counterinsurgent warfare. So even within this racial hierarchy, there's nonetheless in this archive of decolonization a characterization of insurgent hyper-rationality that contrasts sharply with 19th century representations that Ranajit Guha highlighted. So consider the following anecdote. Quote, this is again from Galiula, with us French officers, the Vietnamese chose a subject to which they were sure we would be obliged to respond, cleanliness. They appealed to our pride. They told us how vital it was for us to keep clean so as to avoid diseases. They pointed out that their own soldiers managed to keep clean despite adverse conditions. It seemed so innocent that we swallowed the bait and we began cooperating with them on cleanliness. From then on, little by little, very subtly at first, bluntly later, they succeeded in forcing our cooperation on other matters, and we could not avoid giving it, at least on the surface, end quote. Now, I love this passage, and in particular, this latter phrase, and we could not avoid giving it. And I keep lingering on this phrase, which I find to be a revealing and quite extraordinary concession. I'm beginning to realize that I'm less interested in a kind of deterministic approach that portrays the counterinsurgent as militaristically imposing his will on hapless insurgents than in a framework that registers how both figures mutually constitute and shape the other, again, often unwittingly. So for this purpose, I've been drawn to the work of Laleh Khalili, a political scientist who has written extensively on counterinsurgency, including on its affective dimensions. So I'm aware of the time, so I want to try to wrap it up soon, and I'll just say a little bit about Khalili's work and why I think it's really important and useful to me. She's written a lot on counterinsurgency, but one article in particular has made a big impression on me, and that is her work on the uses of what she calls the uses of happiness in counterinsurgency. And here she draws attention to a certain element in counterinsurgent discourse that has to do with the counterinsurgent attempt to, first of all, conviction that the best way to conduct counterinsurgency is to to pacify the population and to win them over to the counterinsurgent side is to develop affective ties, even intimate ties with the population, to produce happiness and security among this population. And there is a kind of discourse of happiness that focuses on reading the native population and the visible signs of happiness, smiles. How do populations go from a sort of sullen state to a happy one? Is the population sullen when the counterinsurgents arrive, and are they happier and more willing to cooperate with the counterinsurgents after a certain period of time? There's a certain kind of assumption about the legibility of the colonized population that is rooted in very old colonialist assumptions and protocols, as Khalili demonstrates quite clearly. She writes, quote, "The colonial vernacular is notably familiar from a broad variety of contexts. The implicit comparison between the happy natives of one place and the sullen natives of another points not only to the geographic reach of empire, but also to its affective classification of colonized people on the basis of their perceived docility in the heat of colonial counterinsurgencies. For example, in an account of the intransigence of Filipinos during the US colonization of that island in 1899, a proponent of empire declares that, quote, the mirthful, easygoing African is superior to these treacherous and bloodthirsty hybrid Malays, end quote. The racial categories, and this is still Khalili's passage, overlay an intuited and felt affective map, itself generated through an assessment of a people in conditions of colonial conquest. Now, Khalili does not mention Galula, but the French captain and theorist of counterinsurgency fits perfectly into the affective framework she identifies. In another passage, he writes, we knew we had to win over the population. And he cites another figure who discouraged any show of indiscriminate hostility toward Kabilas on the part of his unit, always had his pockets full of candy for the kids and a ready smile for the adults whom he treated with studied courtesy. Look straight into the eyes of the people you greet was his favorite formula. Their expression does not lie. This is how you can gauge their spirit and their inner thoughts. To me, his greatest asset, and Galula is referring to his colleague in Algeria. To me, his greatest asset was his open mind and his willingness to accept suggestions, and we got along very well. The point he's making here is that, is about this kind of the importance of not only developing affective ties with the population, but sort of reading their faces literally as a way of gauging the success of the counterinsurgency effort. So I'm going to cut my presentation a little short, but I do want to end just with where I wanted to go, just to continue with sort of the racial element in counterinsurgency discourse. So Galula does make a pretty firm division between, or bifurcation between the Algerian population along the lines of a certain bifurcation of the population into Arabs and Kabilas, which is the indigenous population of Algeria. And he writes, for example, Kabilas have a primitive yet definite talent for organizing, which puts them far above the Arabs in this respect. They also have an amazing sense of dialectic, which often put to shame some of my young officers when they thought they could press a fuzzy propaganda line on the villagers. I'm going to read from another passage here, and he says, they are the aboriginals belonging to the same, to the Berber stock, and they have their own language, quite different from Arabic, but it is only a spoken one, for they never developed a writing system. That's actually not true, but another discussion here. In spite of some intermarriage with Arabs, they have generally retained their distinct physical and intellectual features. Blonde, blue-eyed people are not uncommon among them. of all the people of North Africa, they are the least influenced by Islam. So here, Galiula harkens back to a sort of 19th century colonial division of the Algerian and wider Maghrebian population into sort of Arab and Berber, or Arab and Amazigh, which is the preferred term for the indigenous populations of North Africa. And I don't have time to go into it here. I can expand a little bit on during our Q&A, but this division that is mobilized in counterinsurgency discourse has really important ramifications for subsequent politics and conflicts in North Africa. That, you know, so, and I'm particularly interested in the linguistic dimension, and so I'm happy to say more about that during our discussion. But in the interest of time, I will conclude now, and thank you very much for your time and attention.
All right, thank you so much, Vaughn. That was really interesting, really fascinating. So remember, to the audience, to please go ahead and type your questions if you have them into the Q&A, and I'll be sure to pose them to Professor Raspberry, or if you say that you would prefer to be unmuted, you can ask directly. I'll go ahead and start though with some questions. So the first is that I was wondering if drawing up a counterinsurgency doctrine is also a function, of course, of the technology that you have available militarily. So the technology either to develop intelligence, to collect intelligence, which has become somewhat easier in the digital age, perhaps through wiretapping or documentation of financial flows of rebel groups or insurgent groups, but also the military technology whereby you don't really have to engage in ground operations sometimes to have an effective counterinsurgency strategy. For example, we've become so reliant on drones. Do you think that, you know, to what extent has the rhetoric around insurgency and counterinsurgency changed as a function of military technology also changing?
Thank you, Didi, for that question. It's an excellent question, and you know, I want to answer it by quoting a great passage. She actually draws attention to this very dynamic that in sort of in counterinsurgency in let's say the mid 20th century, as it is sort of being theorized on the ground, there's a sense that that, you know, that face-to-face encounters are of the utmost importance, and that even extends to killing. So if you give me just one moment here, I want to find this quote. So as one Vietnam era counterinsurgent argued, counterinsurgency, quote, is a political war and it calls for discrimination in killing. The best weapon for killing would be a knife, but I'm afraid we can't do it that way. The worst is an airplane. The next worst is artillery. Barring a knife, the best is a rifle. You know who you're killing. So, you know, in the 21st century, with the onset of drone technology, you know, I'm not sure even if that the sort of fits even to a kind of classical paradigm. This would be, I mean, you know, if we were to query any of these progenitors of counterinsurgency doctrine, I mean, they would say that that is the sort of worst form of counterinsurgency, unless your goal is just to eliminate the whole population, and that could be achieved by other means, you know. So I'm not really sure how contemporary technology, again, as it increases the distance between insurgent and counterinsurgents, even really fits into a counterinsurgency paradigm, which I think, you know, what kinds of information gathering, knowledge production, and relationships even on the ground are necessary or even desirable in this new 21st century context? So it's an excellent question. So I'm not really even sure how drone warfare and the like would, and other technologies that again increase the distance between insurgent and counterinsurgent, really fit into. But I'm confident that they do in a way, but in a way that I'm not really sure we're able to understand yet. Except though, I think that it's really, that it's really important. It's a really important insight for, let's say, classical counterinsurgency, that both conflict and violence on the one hand, and affective relationships on the other, sort of go hand in hand. This is why killing is better. I'm sorry, this is why killing with a knife is better than shooting with a gun, which is itself better than dropping a bomb.
Right. Okay, thank you so much. We have a question from Ayça Alamdaroglu, who runs our program on Turkey, as a scholar of Middle Eastern politics at CDDRL. I'm going to offer to have her speak directly, but if she is not responsive, then I'll go ahead and ask her question. So Ayça, are you available to ask a question? All right. If not, Ayça. Okay, I will ask her question directly then. She's wondering if you could elaborate more specifically on how the historical experience fighting in the colonies, fighting counterinsurgency there, continue to shape US counterinsurgency in Iraq.
So in the colonies, you know, the historical experience in the colonies, that's a great question. Thank you. It's a difficult question for me to answer on the spot, because I think that we might have to be a little bit more specific about what historical experience we're talking about in which colonies. But if we were to kind of paint with a broader brush, let's just take, for example, the conflict of like this latter point that I was drawing on, this question of like comparative racialization within the colonies, and even ethnic divisions produced along linguistic lines. Now, I mean, the person who asked this question would probably know, as a expert in Middle Eastern politics, would probably know much more on this topic than I do. But if we consider like the case of Algeria, for example, and in North Africa, this sort of calcified division and bifurcation of the Algerian population into, say, like Arab and Amazigh, or Arab Berber, as to use the nomenclature of the time. Now this difference existed in pre-colonial society, but it becomes sort of sedimented in the colonial context, and there, as even Galliula's comments suggest, Galliula was drawing on colonial ethnography when he valorized the Kabyle population at the expense of the Arab population, even though the sort of intermixture between both populations renders some of those distinctions kind of sort of absurd. Now, but they have real consequences in Algeria and other places. Now, I don't know about in Iraq necessarily, but I do think that this one thing that is sort of continuous is this is a logic of racial, ethnic, and linguistic stratification that is something that these modern post-colonial nation states themselves have to reckon with. So that's one way to answer it. I'm not sure that doesn't really answer for the specificity of Iraq. But one thing that another point of entry into that question um, might have to do with another, element. So if we think about like the characterization of Saddam Hussein in the months leading up to the invasion of Iraq, this portrayal of him. So the government wasn't able to draw a connection between um, Saddam Hussein and Al Qaeda. So they sort of shifted the discursive register to characterize him as a kind of totalitarian leader who, um, murdered his own people and so on and so forth. So, there was a kind of discursive shift that that they used to mobilize support both domestically and internationally for this invasion, and that um, um, that characterization of Saddam Hussein and other leaders in this region, comports with what we saw as a discourse of Islamic fascism that various officials, commentators, pundits sought to instantiate with, I think, limited success. Um, you know, but that would be maybe another way of kind of connecting the dots between past and present. So I can say more about that, but I'm sure there are probably other questions, so I'll stop there.
Well, there is a sort of general question about the fact that there's a prevalence of sort of neoliberalism and democracy around the world now, and it's not super specific, but basically just that there are people who are still aggrieved, even though there are different types of governments. There's no longer colonialism in its sort of traditional form necessarily. But do you have any thoughts, I suppose, on regime type and how that affects both insurgency and counterinsurgency, whether on the part of the insurgents or the counterinsurgents? And then I'd like to follow up on that with a question about domestic politics and the rhetoric of counterinsurgency domestically. But I guess this broader question first about whether regime type sort of conditions some of the rhetoric around insurgency and counterinsurgency.
Thank you, Didi, for that question. I think regime type is absolutely critical, and I mean, I don't have a well thought out answer, but rather an intuitive answer that has to do with the perception among liberal democracies that the regime in question resembles or has the capacity to resemble liberal democratic capitalist regime. In other words, counterinsurgencies generally take root when a regime in question is unstable or collapsing or in some volatile state, facing challenges from internal and sometimes external competitors. But also, I think that, if counterinsurgents also are looking for resemblances of constituencies within the regime that comport with Western democratic protocols. So, is there an opportunity for democratization of this regime? I think that this is again an intuitive response to me, but is there an opportunity to draw out that element of that or that constituency for democratization or not? And the answer, how a counterinsurgency or say a Western government that is, initiating or thinking about initiating a counterinsurgency is probably thinking about whether that potential exists or not. And I think my sense is that that probably is determinative. I'm speculating here because this is well outside of my area, but that is sort of, I think, there's a certain logic of, and particularly when we think about, counterinsurgency in the mid 20th century, as it is connected to anti-communism, of course. So even like, Galula came out of various anti-communist theaters, China, Vietnam, Greece, that absolutely shaped his own approach to counterinsurgency. And there are others who I think would um, shared a similar experience. So I think that anti-communism also has a role, had a role in shaping this early phase of counterinsurgency warfare in the mid 20th century.
Okay, great. So we have two questions coming in these final few minutes. So I'd love to get to both of them. I am going to go ahead and see if Steve Stedman is interested in asking directly. Let me see. Steve.
Yeah. Can you hear me, Didi?
Yes, we can all hear you.
Great. Vaughn, this is fascinating stuff. As you were talking, it struck me that in the 1950s and through the 1980s, counterinsurgency was an international activity with early practitioners in France and Britain sharing lessons from their experiences with new practitioners in places like Chile and Argentina, who then shared their experience with South Africans. And so it strikes me, how do you think of the lessons of counterinsurgency gained from past practitioners compares to the lessons gleaned from art, like the Battle for Algiers? And have you thought about focusing on torture, its efficacy and appropriateness, and its role in counterinsurgency? Because it seems that might have been a super salient issue for the Pentagon in 2003.
What a fantastic question. Thank you, Stephen, for it. It's a tough one. I mean, so there are two important questions here. One about the lessons of counterinsurgency gained from past practitioners versus the lessons gleaned from art. I'll have to meditate on that question a little bit. I mean, I'd like to think of those lessons as not segregated, but it may be operating in some kind of synergy. I don't, so this is a short way of, this is a certain way of saying I don't know, actually, the answer to that question. I think I would have to ruminate on it a little bit. But I think that, what is interesting about the lessons gained from art, and let's say the Battle of Algiers especially, is that, it is serving in some ways two different constituencies. And I'm interested in that I don't know if it's a tension, but maybe it's just a different kind of reception history. How is it that it is actually inspiring to anti-colonial insurgents, revolutionaries worldwide, but also something, that contains important lessons for counterinsurgents themselves? Maybe that isn't all that surprising. Maybe those two dynamics are actually easily reconcilable. But I do think of what the Battle of Algiers provided that maybe other lessons from specific like revolutionaries could not provide, is a sort of dramatization of warfare and other dimensions that are not reducible to lessons of war. So like why were these actors willing to risk their lives? What were they fighting for? What is the kind of society that they're trying to there's some wonderful, almost this is a kind of almost a throwaway scene in the film. There's a moment in Battle of Algiers that is so beautiful and so subtle to me. One of the female revolutionaries is about to enter a cafe with a bomb, and she brings her child to an old man who is sort of in the area, and she's talking with him, but we don't actually hear the content of that conversation. She's basically asking him to watch her child while she goes into this cafe to blow it up. And I thought, wow, and it's clear, it's not clear, exactly their relationship, but he's probably a stranger. And, it's a wonderful moment, because in some ways that crystallizes what they're fighting for. They're fighting for a society where you can leave your child with a perfect stranger while you handle your business. That's something that can't be taught in, that's something that I imagine is not generally taught in these, lessons provided by other revolutionaries that is maybe, I don't know if that's really what you're getting at, Stephen, but I don't know. It's just something that crossed my mind. The other question of yours, I don't see it on the chat anymore. I don't.
It was on. We're beyond time, but if you could answer quickly the question about torture.
Oh, okay, sure. So you know what? So yes, torture is really important, and I let me just say, one one aspect of counterinsurgency, I mean, the question of violence, violent repression is something that is, of course, absolutely important. The importance of it can't be overestimated. But I think that's why I was also maybe curious about the other dimensions that receive shorter shrift, particularly like the affective dimension. But what is interesting about torture is it is actually the intimacy of it, the proximity is actually what makes it so quintessential for counterinsurgency warfare. So again, it is a practice of violence that is not, killing. It is not the use of bombing, of, indiscriminate shooting and the like. It is actually in some ways the form of violence that captures the affective in a really powerful way. I'm not sure I know what to do with it quite yet. It's something that I think I also have to reflect on. But I'm glad that you reminded me of it, and I take that as an invitation to kind of see where it fits in this broader picture. But also but there's also, again, if you're thinking about prose of counterinsurgency, there's a whole, as others here probably know much better than I, an entire archive of prose surrounding the usefulness of torture, the consequences of it, and so forth. So it's a very fertile ground for investigating the prose of counterinsurgency. So that I appreciate that question, that challenge that you posed for me. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you so much, Vaughn. This is really fascinating research. We were very delighted to get to hear it. You say it's incipient, but this seems very well developed to me. And I appreciate everyone who tuned in today. Thank you so much. And Vaughn, we'll see you again, hopefully on campus one day.
I hope so. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for these terrific questions and for your time.